Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Today, I'm talking about the consensus statement that was recently released by the Brookings Institute on the current state of scientific knowledge on pre-kindergarten effects. 10 of the top scholars on issues of early learning came together and outlined what they agree is known and needs to be known about the pre-kindergarten experience. They're tackling tough questions like, what outcomes can we expect in the long and short term from large-scale pre-K programs, and what elements come together to make a high-quality pre-K setting? This is a rigorously scientific discussion of early childhood education. It's the kind of thing that makes my nerdy heart go pitter-patter. You can find the show notes, including a link to the full consensus statement, at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 10. There are some fantastic points served up in this document that promise to add to our discussion here and elsewhere for quite some time. So now, let's get started. So I have to tell you, when I found this document that was recently released by the Brookings Institute, the title is Puzzling It Out, the Current State of Scientific Knowledge on Pre-Kindergarten Effects, a Consensus Statement. I had this, I think it's about 16 pages. Yeah, a 16-page document printed out, sitting by my computer, and I told my husband, I cannot wait to read this. I just don't have time right now. And he looked at me because he was trying to decide if I was being sarcastic or not, because it's a 16-page science-heavy, nerdy discussion about early childhood education, and he was trying to decide if I really meant that I could not wait, and I was really being sincere. I couldn't wait to jump into this. And as I said in the introduction, this is a discussion about early childhood education, but from a very strictly scientific approach. So what these researchers are discussing here is, what do we know about early childhood? What do we not really know yet? And what do we really need to figure out soon to make sure that we are giving the best we can to our kids? And they're doing it, again, from a strictly scientific perspective. So what is the quality of the methods that we're using in our research about early childhood? What do we know from the research we're doing? What can be applied in other situations, and what is kind of restricted by the types of samples we're using or the type of methods that we're using? So these are the types of questions that are being tackled. And if you print out this document, as I mentioned before, you can find the link in my show notes, find the full document and look it over. There are 10 scientists who put their names on this document. And as I looked over, there were several that I recognized from some really fascinating studies that have been in the news recently. And really, these are really high quality researchers who are doing amazing work in the field of early childhood education and research. And as I said, it tells us what is known, what can we say we can say with some scientific assurity that we know, what are we still kind of grasping for, and what are the questions we really need to focus on right now. So let's jump in, and we'll do kind of a brief overview here of what they are stating and some of my thoughts around that. So as they start out this document, they kind of point out some of the stats that we know about pre-kindergarten right now, and particularly as it's becoming more and more prevalent in statewide programs. And they point out that 42 states and the District of Columbia have 57 pre-K programs, and that they are all going through some substantial innovations, and they're working on creating these pre-kindergarten programs on a statewide basis to provide for 3 and 4-year-olds in their areas. And so as this is kind of emerging and expanding, they're looking at what are the questions that we need to answer to make sure that we are making these programs effective for our young learners. And as they point out, some of the main questions that we struggle with as we do so, as we continue to create these programs, is to understand how to make sure that these programs are giving them a boost into kindergarten as well as a base for future learning. And then the question of, what can we expect going forward? What are our long-term projections for pre-kindergarten programs? And finally, the question that that we as educators and as parents, anyone who is passionate about early childhood education, the question of how do we make sure that the kids who are in these programs are getting what they need, that they're getting as much out of that program as they can and as they need. And so these are the general questions that we are all invested in. And to answer those, they became even more specific and said there are 3 main questions that scientists need to resolve. And the first is what they refer to as the black box question, because it's so difficult to answer, and it's kind of like the black box from a plane, right? It's recording what's actually going on and trying to make sense of that for future understanding. And that question is, what is going on in successful programs? So the Abecedarian, the Preschool, the Early Training Project, these programs that have been kind of used as the gold standard for positive outcomes for early childhood education. These programs were studied in the 60s and 70s. So what can we find out about those? What are the elements that produce the positive outcomes that we want for young children? Because that's one of the big questions. And it's something that I've pointed out before, that when we are sold these statewide preschool programs, oftentimes it comes in reference to these programs, that there are these different stats that are thrown out that you get these kinds of outcomes over the long term. And in reality, we can't just say preschool gives us these outcomes, let's create this preschool and expect the same outcomes. We need to know what about that program produced those outcomes before we can replicate it. So that's their first question. And they point out that we don't know what it is precisely, again, from a scientific standpoint, what precisely created those outcomes, those positive outcomes that we're looking for. And so that's why they refer to this as the black box question, and that's one of the main questions that scientists are exploring in this area of early education. And they point out that this is the first question that we need to get more information on, try to answer, so that we, as we replicate programs, as we begin to expand programs, that we make sure, again, that we're not just hanging out a shingle that says preschool and expecting to have all these great results that came from these smaller scale, deeply studied, meticulously designed programs, but that we need to find out what exactly creates positive effects, what components in a program are creating the effects, not just the name preschool, what actual practices. Their second question is related to that, and that is the question of how to scale up. So again, back to those gold standard programs, they were done on a smaller basis and were very successful. So the second question is, how do we take something that is very successful on a small scale and scale up to, for example, a statewide program? How do we scale up and maintain the integrity, the quality of the program? As they point out, it's clear, and this is quoting from their statement, but it is clear that scale up brings with it wide variation in programs, and that this variation must be considered in efforts to understand the conditions under which program impacts are the most positive. So it makes sense that if we're taking a program and we are trying to put it on to a large scale, we are now introducing more variables. We're now introducing different contexts. And so that's one of the challenges as we begin to scale up a program, is to make sure that it is still responsive to the children and families that we're serving, that it's challenging to take a program that's very successful in a specific area and then scale up to a large scale and expect it to have the same results if it's serving different people. And so that's our second question that they've put forward in this document. How do we take a small successful program and scale up to a larger population and still maintain quality and positive effects? And then the third question, and this is a very important question to keep in mind, is how do we take what is known from studies about programs that were done decades ago? How do we take information from that research that is valid and important? How do we take that and apply it to children today and children who are moving forward into the future? So again, that's a very valid question to say, how do we make sure that we use research that was collected in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? This is important because it's building this body of research. It's creating a more longitudinal view. But how do we take that and apply it into a forward-facing approach to early childhood education. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I was speaking recently to a retired administrator when I was speaking at a conference, and we had a great conversation. I learned a great deal from him. And one of the things that he pointed out was that he feels, from his perspective as an administrator, he felt that he could tell when a teacher received their education training based on their approach to teaching, because he felt like, in his experience, a lot of the educators he came in contact with remained frozen at whatever point they were. So they remained frozen with whatever information they learned whenever they got their training. And so if they got their training in the 1960s, the tendency was to stay with whatever perspectives and philosophies were held then. And if it was the 70s and 80s and so on. And his feeling was it's so important for teachers to remain current and to be open to new research, new understandings, new approaches, and to recognize the value going forward rather than just clinging to the past as one gold standard, but to take that background and move forward and apply it in new ways, combine it with new understandings. And so that third question applies in a similar way there. Again, from a scientific standpoint, it's saying we can take information from research in the past and we can use that going forward, but we have to remain focused on the reality that children in the 1960s, their environment, their experiences is not the same as children in 2017 and children in 2018 and 2020. Moving forward, as we design these programs, we need to value that information that came from earlier research, but we need to keep it in the right context, recognizing that we can't control all of those variables. And so we have to recognize that there are a lot of other things in the context that introduce new variables, and that as we design going forward, that we keep that in mind, recognizing that we're designing programs for today and tomorrow, but the information we're using comes from yesterday. And so we have to keep that perspective in line. And so those are the 3 points that they are focused on as they write this paper. And I think in large part as they do the work that they're doing, I think in some ways it's these researchers coming forward and saying, this is our work. This is what we are trying to accomplish with the work that we're doing. And so there are those 3 questions. One, to look inside that black box of quality early childhood education, quality pre-K experiences. What is going on to create that quality experience? What are the key components? The second question was to understand how to scale up, to take a small scale quality program and increase the scale to serve more children, but to still keep the integrity and quality. And then the third question, or the third perspective, was to look at how to take information from the past and apply it to the future, recognizing that context will change. And so as they look at those 3 questions, those 3 challenges that they're facing as researchers, they then divide up the approach to pre-kindergarten by dividing it into 3 different parts. I think 3 different parts of the developmental lifespan. And I think it's really important that they point this out, that as we look at the pre-kindergarten experience, we can't look just at the pre-kindergarten years. And so they divided up and discussed the pre-kindergarten years. So what happens before pre-kindergarten, and then what happens during pre-kindergarten experiences, and then what happens after pre-kindergarten. Because as we talk about the effects of pre-kindergarten experiences in the short and long term, all 3 of these factors come into play. It's not just what's happening in the pre-kindergarten classroom, but it's also what happens before and what happens after. All of those components are going to play into the information that we're getting back from research about how pre-kindergarten affects children. So one of the things that they can agree on is they look over this body of research about pre-kindergarten experiences, is that the impact of those experiences tend to be stronger or larger for children who come from an economically disadvantaged background, as well as for children who come from dual language learner backgrounds. And so for these children, a preschool experience, the outcomes are stronger. So the return on investment, if you want to put it that way, is larger. And that makes sense, right? That if children have greater needs and we create an opportunity to meet those needs more efficiently, more effectively, that the outcome becomes greater. That we find that children from more advantaged backgrounds, that the effect of a quality preschool experience is still, I think it's still there, but it's not as strong. And to me, this is one of possibly the best arguments for greater access to early childhood education. It's a great irony that those who can most easily access quality early childhood education, so those who can pay for a prestigious, high-quality preschool, need it the least, in a sense, or that it is affecting the least because they're getting a lot of those experiences already in the home for many of those children or from other avenues. And so children who need it the most, who will benefit from it the most, are least likely to be able to access it without help from a public program or some type of outreach to make it available to them. That these are the children who will benefit from it the most are not the ones who are most likely to be able to have families who can afford a hefty tuition for preschool. And so I think it's a great argument for making preschool available to those who need it most. It's really important to point out, which they do towards the ends of this discussion about what happens before children enter a pre-kindergarten program, that again, that children come from all different backgrounds, and that's important to keep in mind as we look at this research, that we can't isolate every variable because the children come in from different backgrounds and different experiences, and that will influence the way that they experience pre-kindergarten. But it's also important, they point out that this understanding that children who come from a more disadvantaged background will benefit the most from preschool. They do point out that it's important not to confuse that and make an assumption that that means that we don't need to provide preschool experiences for children who come from more advantaged backgrounds. That not only because it will benefit them, but they point out that it's again hard to isolate where these benefits come from, that we can't just say that these children who are showing huge benefits are benefiting in isolation, but that it's very likely the interconnection of all of these children being together. In fact, they state the value of being immersed among a diverse array of classmates with whom to learn. That all children benefit when they are educated together in a diverse setting. And so even though they point out and agree that children from less advantaged situations benefit more from having a pre-kindergarten experience, they also point out that it's important to include all children because they benefit from one another, that they support one another, and the interactions between one another are part of what create these great outcomes. So in that second section, they're talking about what's going on during the pre-kindergarten years. So what is actually happening in the classroom that is going to benefit young children? What do we know about the actual time in the classroom that's going to create those positive outcomes that we're looking for? Because that's what we're after as we're designing and implementing these programs. We want to create something that's going to be effective. And so that's what this second part looks at. And they point out that learning and development are, as they say, cumulative, continuous, and self-reinforcing. And so they talk about the different objectives as children attend a pre-kindergarten program, things like learning letter words and sound, counting and mathematical concepts, learning to share and take turns, building a rich vocabulary and problem-solving strategies, building a base for scientific and cultural knowledge and strong narrative skills. And then I love this part, that engaged young learners also display positive attitudes about school and about themselves as students, as well as foundational capacities to focus attention, remember and follow directions, avoid distractions, and get along with others. So it's this full package that we're looking for, right? These basic academic skills, as well as the social skills and the approaches to learning that help children to be successful. So that's the full package that we're looking for in the pre-kindergarten years. And I really value this statement, and it's similar to something that I've said many times before. This is on page 6. They say, quote, Yet we know that not all pre-K programs successfully support early learning. It is decidedly not the case that just any pre-K program operating under just any circumstances will provide young children with the inputs they need to produce, let alone sustain, early developmental gains. So what components of a pre-K program are especially important to accomplishing these goals? What might be the factors that make one pre-K program more effective than another? So just like I've said before, we can't just hang out a shingle that says preschool and hope that we get all the beneficial outcomes that have been found in various studies for children who attend preschool, that it's actually what goes on in the classroom that helps to build these schools, to help to build these outcomes. And so that's their question. That's what they're looking at in this section. What's actually going on in the classroom, because it's not just any preschool in just any environment. What are the components that actually produce outcomes? And I was so happy to see that one of the very first things that they point out as a key ingredient is what they call the instructional, social, and emotional serve and return interactions that occur daily between teachers and children, as well as among classmates. So in this section, they talk about the importance of consistent and responsive interactions and the importance of that and how critical that is for early learning. And that's something that I've seen in several other places, that again, it's not just these scripted outcomes, but it's responsive interactions. And I find this particularly interesting and particularly important because I think, again, as we go back, just as they're pointing out here, looking at being rigorous and scientific in our approach to early childhood education, that is important because that's how we can find out some of these definitive answers to the questions that we have, and that will help us to design more effective programs. At the same time, however, it's hard to have an effective preschool environment that is overly regimented and scripted so as to isolate all variables, right? So I have no problem with approaching pre-kindergarten in a strictly scientific sense, as these researchers are doing. That's necessary to preserve the integrity of the studies. But in the practice in the classroom, I struggle very much with an approach that scripts our interactions, or that tries to create a formulaic approach to the extreme to where it's no longer responsive. And that's something that I've heard on occasion from teachers saying that they've essentially been handed a script and that that's how they're supposed to teach. And I think this is well-intentioned, well-meaning, that they're taking what's known and they're applying it to a script and they're giving it to a teacher and hoping that they can be more effective in that way. But we just can't get away from the reality that one of the best things we can do for young children is to take those things that are known and not apply them to a script, but apply them to a responsive environment, something that respects, again, the serve and return. And they use that phrase in quotes, and it's something that's used in a lot of research about human development and human relationships and the importance of a responsive interactions with one another, just as the phrase refers to serve and return, such as in a tennis or volleyball match, maybe with a little less aggressiveness, right? But that the return responds to the serve. You can't stand in the same place on the court and return every serve because the serves come differently, that you have to respond to where that serve lands in order to return. And it's referring to this responsiveness that has to be there, that you have to be able to move, you have to be able to be agile, you have to be able to improvise on occasion, to be responsive to where children are at, to respond to the serve, not to where you're standing on the court, but to where that serve goes, to be responsive to young children. And that's the first thing that they outline as a key ingredient to effective classroom experiences in pre-kindergarten. The others that they outline as good bets. So as we talk about consistent responsive interactions, that was a key ingredient. The next parts they say are good bets for supporting strong early learning. Because again, that there's research that varies, and these are excellent scientists, and so they're hedging their bet slightly by calling it a good bet. The first is quality curricula, and as they say, curricula that are known to build foundational skills and knowledge. The second is professional development and coaching that enables teachers to, number 3, create organized and engaging classrooms. So those are the 3 things that they outline. And I feel like this is the art and science of quality teaching, right? This is the head, the hands, and the heart, that we need good teachers that know good practice and who have good curricula that also have the heart aspect of being able to be responsive. They've had the coaching aspects to be able to implement what they know in an effective and responsive way. And then the third part, the hands, to be able to have organized and engaging classrooms that function and the process that is followed allows children to be successful and to anticipate what's expected of them and to be able to implement it in an effective way. So as they talk about that first part, talking about having quality curricula, the importance of that, I was pleased to see that one of the things that they point out is the importance of this curricula to have carefully sequenced lessons that support, build on, and can be adapted to each stage in a child's learning progression. So again, pointing out that we need quality curricula that can still be adapted, that can still be responsive to young children. That again, this is not saying we need to open up a box and pull out the gold standard quality curricula and apply it in a script robotic fashion, but that to have effective curricula that is of high quality, we need to be able to be responsive to our children, that we need to apply developmentally appropriate practice. As they say in this section, early learning is supported when children experience instruction that scaffolds the deeper underlying processes that support learning at this age, such as reasoning and explaining, persisting when challenges are met, and transferring skills from one task to the next. So they need to be able to support not just input and output of knowledge, but the processes of learning how to learn and how to approach the learning process. And that can't be overlooked. And I worry about that sometimes when I see too much emphasis on performance or skill outcome, but that I feel that it is of paramount importance that we focus on the procedures, the process of learning, the approaches to learning, of curiosity and asking questions and finding answers and reasoning and discussing, that these are critical components of a high quality early childhood experience. So the second factor that they point out is professional development and coaching. And that's something that should go without saying, but unfortunately is missing. That sometimes when a new curriculum is introduced, it comes without the appropriate professional development and coaching that would allow teachers to be successful. That sometimes best practice or theories or philosophies are introduced without the support needed to help the teachers to actually implement it in a successful way. As they say in here, and it nails it exactly, they say curricula are only as effective as their implementation. So we can get all the greatest minds together, create the very best curricula that we can have, but if it's not implemented correctly, then it's only as good as that implementation. And that's why it's critical that we invest the time and the resources to giving teachers support and professional development and coaching to help them to implement the work that's going on in the classroom. The third good bet factor that they talk about is organized, positive, and engaging classroom environments. And so this is talking about things like transitions and routines and the importance of creating an environment and an atmosphere that allows children to be successful and reduces some of those time wasters or conflicts or distractions. And I love, as they say, predictable routines enable young children to become increasingly independent as they initiate their own learning. And that children who experience primarily positive, supportive interactions with their teachers are more comfortable exploring, making mistakes, and thus seeking out and persisting with challenging tasks. So again, this is talking about the importance of the environment and the process and procedures that are in the classroom and their influence on child outcomes. And it's not just good classroom management and an orderly atmosphere, but that these components, creating those things, all contribute to a child's approaches to learning, their attitudes about learning and the classroom, and themselves as learners. So we've talked about the time before the pre-kindergarten experience and the time during the pre-kindergarten experience. The third section is the impacts of experiences after pre-kindergarten. And this is really important as we discuss outcomes from pre-kindergarten, because as we talk about children who took part in a pre-kindergarten program or didn't, and then we project going forward and we start looking at outcomes, it's really difficult to make a clean-cut distinction between outcomes for those who attended the program and those who did not, because there's so much that goes on in those 20 or so years after that pre-kindergarten experience that will influence those outcomes, that we take 1 year of preschool and put it on the line against, again, 2 decades of after preschool experiences, and then try to find the commonalities there. And that's a challenge, again, for scientists as they're looking at these long-range studies. So as they point out here, those experiences that happen after pre-kindergarten will have a significant impact on the outcomes going forward. And so a child who has an outstanding pre-kindergarten experience, but then has terrible experiences following that, will not be expected to have the same positive outcomes that you might find from another child who had the same pre-kindergarten experience, but then had positive experiences going forward. And so they acknowledge that as we look at the research about pre-kindergarten, as we look at it from a long-range view, we have to take into consideration that all those years following that pre-kindergarten year are going to influence that outcome. And as they discuss this, they point out of particular importance recognizing those early elementary years following pre-kindergarten. Oftentimes, as we look at the research in early childhood, in pre-kindergarten or preschool experiences, we notice what's called a fade-out effect that happens in the early elementary school years, usually around second grade or so. And there's a lot of discussion around that about what causes that. Is it a burnout effect? Is it fading out because they're just catching up? Those who didn't attend preschool are catching up as they attend first and second grade. And what the researchers point out in this paper is that I love the metaphor that they use. They talk about early elementary school as charging stations. So they talk about children who attend pre-kindergarten are charged up, right? That they're filled up with all this potential. But that if we don't look at the years that follow in elementary school as continued charging stations, then that charge is going to fizzle out. They're going to lose that ground, which makes sense. But what they point out is that sometimes this initial gain that comes through the pre-kindergarten year is then lost as children are not continually supported at the level that they were in that pre-kindergarten experience. So they made all these gains leading up to kindergarten, and then were not supported appropriately as they entered those early elementary years, that early elementary experience. As they say, classroom experiences early in elementary school can serve as charging stations for sustaining and amplifying pre-K learning gains. One good bet for powering up later learning is elementary school classrooms that provide individualization and differentiation in instructional content and strategies. They point out that when we don't differentiate, when we don't individualize our instruction, that some of these kids are lost. Those gains are lost. As they say, the initial boost will have to be recharged as they go through these elementary years. And so they're looking at what needs to be done in these early elementary years to make sure that investment, that boost that was given in the pre-kindergarten years is sustained and not lost. And I love this point on page 7 towards the bottom. They say there is no point at which development proceeds on automatic pilot. And I love that line. There is no point at which development proceeds on automatic pilot. So recognizing that we can't just give a charge in pre-K and expect that that's going to continue unfettered regardless of what we provide in the years that follow. That it's great to see all of this excitement and investment and attention that's being given to pre-K programs, but that if we don't follow that up by supporting high quality kindergarten programs and first grade programs and second grade programs and on, that benefit, that charge can be expected to fizzle out because we're not giving the same degree of support. That's not just an inoculation that's going to carry through, but that it needs to continually be boosted, that there is no point that development is going to continue on autopilot, but that we need to give continual support. They say on page 8, PreK can thus be viewed as powering up early learning, for which the elementary grades need to provide essential charging stations that sustain and amplify the learning gains made by children in PreK. Absent recharging, progress will likely be stalled, and the benefits from any boost provided by PreK education may be lost. Skipping down a little bit, they say too much redundancy or lessons that are too advanced run the risk of inadvertently creating learning dead zones that interrupt educational progress and may squander PreK gains. So again, it's another argument that we make sure that we are having responsive classroom environments that are recognizing learners as individuals and responding to learners as individuals. And that's a big challenge for all of education. That's a big challenge, a big question that's being faced by educators. But it's something that is strongly supported, that each child is recognized as an individual learner and is supported individually where they are. Again, it's scaffolding, it's developmentally appropriate practice, once again, that children do best when we support where they are and build from there. So their second to last section, they talk about the evidence that we have right now for immediate gains and long run gains for pre-kindergarten programs. And as they talk about that, they mostly discuss the challenges that are there, that it's challenging, again, to talk about the outcomes from pre-K programs when we have so many different types of programs, so many different factors playing into it as we look over the long range. And that this becomes very challenging to create a consistent body of research with strong methodology to really look at from a rigorous scientific perspective. But it's also really important to consider why we're looking at the research. And I think they make a great statement here on page 8 that says, with such diversity in programs and experiences, it is not meaningful to talk about state-sponsored pre-K as if it were a single intervention for which we would expect research to reach a general conclusion about whether it works. So while they concede that there are a lot of challenges in finding, again, consistent replicated data, they point out that it's really not meaningful to talk about these programs as though it was one thing, because there are different approaches and there need to be different approaches. That what we really need to know is how well are we serving the children in our care? That what are we doing for those kids and how is it working for them? Because we can't necessarily take some place as large and diverse as the United States of America and take all of those different programs and assume that they're all the same and then run the studies and assume that we're going to get all the same outcomes. So they're basically saying this is a challenge, but that's okay. Because it's really not meaningful for us to try to look at them all as though they are the same, because it's just not the way that it is. So as they end this section about what is known, they of course note that there are a lot of challenges, but mention that on balance, there's a lot of promising potential about the good outcomes that come from early childhood programs. And that again, a lot of these really strong studies come from some small scale programs. And so again, part of our challenge is to figure out where we do have research that is strong methodologically, that we can take what is known from those and figure out how to scale up and still make them effective, that's still one of those challenges. But again, that there are challenges in studying because there are so many variables that cannot be controlled. There's a need for responsiveness, which makes programs inherently different. And so that's a big challenge for researching and studying education as a science. But that at the same time, there is strong research. There are very promising glimmers that come from some solid studies that are telling us that we are on the right track and that there there is great promise in these programs for young children and that we need to continue to study it. And so that's the last section that they put out, is what their suggestions are as we move forward for future innovation and evaluation of early childhood programs. And inasmuch as they have led up to this section talking about the challenges that they face, the questions that they have, and the struggle that is studying early childhood education, they point out still that while this is hard to do, that it is still promising and exciting work. They say on page 10, no one thinks we have yet devised the most effective possible pre-K program. Despite evidence that pre-K can provide an effective foundation for moving children along a successful path into school and some promising, though mixed evidence of enduring impacts, we lack the kind of specific, reliable, consistent evidence we need to move from early models to refinements and redesigns. And so they call for more studies, continue to look at this, continue to do research to find effective programs. And they call upon both scientists and policymakers to make sure, and I love that that they call for this, to make sure that they match evidence to real world conditions, so that we take what we know from scientific evidence, that we apply it to real world conditions, but again, that we take care in making that match, that we don't try to over apply or take out important components and expect the same results, that we need to take great care in matching evidence to real world conditions. They note in this last section that they actually use the word struggle, that they went through struggle as a group to come to an agreement on these different components. And I think that speaks to the fact that while there's great research and information and best practices that we understand, that there are still areas for discussion and for innovation and to try to put together the best possible solution for our young children. And I think the fact that 10 of the brightest minds on these subjects still struggled to come to a consensus, to me, that actually gives me hope. And I think it gives a great template for us to follow as we work together as educators and continue these discussions as we struggle together to find a consensus of our best approaches for our learners, and to take the time to build a coalition, to have discussions, to find different ways to approach the problems and challenges that we face, and to do it in a responsive way to our individual circumstances. So they reiterate their challenge as scientists to continue to apply themselves to finding what components create a quality early childhood education, specifically a pre-K experience for young children, to continue to find research-based evidence of what makes a high-quality experience and creates positive outcomes for young children. And second to that, which I'm glad they also called out, is what can we do to find, to recruit, to retain, to train, and develop quality pre-K teachers as well. And I love that they recognize the importance of strong teachers, and that it takes effort and planning and compensation and training to develop and keep good teachers. And that in and of itself, I think, recognizes the vital importance of quality teachers to this whole experience for early childhood education. I think it can be easy to get caught up in all these pieces and parts of creating an early childhood program. All of those pieces are important. What kind of structure do we have? What kind of a building? What kind of curricula do we use in these different programs? But that we also have to recognize that at the heart of all of that is an early childhood professional who, again, going back to the head, hands, and heart analogy, who has all of those pieces and parts, who can apply the art and science of good teaching. That we need these quality educators, and we need to support them, and we need to do what it takes to train them well, to give them this knowledge that's coming out of these best minds and best institutions for studying early childhood outcomes, that we arm them with this information. We give them the tools and the resources and support, and that we help them to grow as professionals, and we retain them. We do what it takes to keep them in the profession so that they can continue to grow and develop as professionals over the long term as well. And I think that that will have great outcomes as we look at what will give us a good return on the investment of early childhood education, of pre-K programs. We have to pay attention to those teachers. We have to make sure that we are compensating them in a way that will keep them, that we respect them as professionals, we support them as professionals. And I think that's another component that, again, they don't spend a lot of time on in this section, but that they mention as an important key component to looking at what we can do moving forward. And I think that's an important discussion to have, and one that could take an entire segment unto itself. To sum up their consensus statement, there's a lot that is left to be answered about what makes a quality pre-K experience. We have to take into account what happens before a child gets there, what happens during their experience in a pre-K program, and what happens afterwards. And there are a lot of moving parts and variables that need to be attended to in each of those phases. As we create, design, implement pre-K programs, we need to look at the questions that these researchers continue to ask. Number one, what is it that creates a quality early childhood or pre-K experience? Number two, how do we scale up from these small experimental programs that do show positive outcomes? How do we take that to a larger number of kids and still keep a responsive approach? And number three, how do we take what we know from past programs, even those that go back decades, and apply that forward to the future for kids today and tomorrow and on and on? These are great questions, and I'm glad that we have some of the greatest minds looking at them. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this paper. You can look it up by finding the link on my blog in the show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 10. And you can leave me your comments by going to my contact page up at the top heading of my blog as well. Click on that contact link, and there will be fields there for you to fill in and share your thoughts and comments with me. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 10. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. And follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.